So in Godot, once we get the model into Godot, we're a bit limited in terms of what we can do with it. We can't edit. So like when we import one of these scenes, we can see the scene and we can see what's in there, but we can't really edit the scene. But we can make changes to it, so we can add materials and we can add colliders, and those are two things that we're going to want to be able to do in order to actually interact with this stuff that's in our scene. So I'm just going to start with the chair model that I created myself and give a couple examples, and then we'll also add stuff to the other models that we added. So the chair model that I added is pretty simple. I'll open it up in Blender. So I'll open up Blender and I'm going to import the model. Okay, I just called it example, but that's the chair. Okay, so here's my chair model. Oh, it looks kind of weird. Why does it look like that? Oh, I still have my cube in here. Whoops. Okay, so there's the chair. Oh, that's like an earlier version of the chair that I made. Maybe I need to import the other one. GLB? There it is. Okay, so let's delete this. I'm just hitting X and then delete. Oh, I think my screencast keys are off. Okay, let's turn those on. Okay, whoops. Okay, so here's the chair that we made last week, and there's no material. It's a pretty simple mesh, but there's two things I might want to be able to do with this in Godot. One is add a collision, so I can't just like walk through the chair, and then the other is change the material or add the material. In Blender, I just made this as a mesh. There's no material at all, so we need to add a material once it's in Godot. So I'm going to leave this open for a moment, but I'm going to go over to Godot. So here's our chair. You can see it actually has a material on it. So I'm going to delete this instance and bring it back in because I was just testing it out earlier. Okay, so there's my chair without the material. And so if I open this scene, as we've already seen, I can, see it here, but I can't make changes to it. I can't edit the model. But what I can do is I can add stuff to the mesh. And so if I want to add a material, what I can do in Godot is when I have the material selected, if I right-click on the node in the scene tree, there's an option that says editable children. If I turn that on, we're going to see the stuff that's inside that scene. And so I can make changes to the instance of the scene here. I can't make changes to the original scene. So I can make changes to the instance, and I could make that instance a separate scene if I want those changes to exist in every other scene that it's in. But I can make changes here. So I can add a material. Once I select this, I can go to my materials folder, and I can, drag a material on here. And I can change it to whatever I want. And then I can also add a collider. And there's a couple different ways that I can add a collider. There's actually a bunch of ways that I can add a collider. I'm going to show a few. Okay, so there's my chair. It's got a material, but if I play the game, I'll be able to just walk straight through the chair. And, that's not very realistic. Although the chair is pretty small. I wonder why it's so small. I should make it bigger. Maybe since I have it open, let's size it up. So I'm just going to apply the scale and then export. Okay. I can't tell if it actually got bigger or not. I don't think it did. Okay. I'll just leave it, whatever. Okay, so there's a couple ways I can make a collider. So I can just add a collider shape, like a primitive shape. And if I don't really care if it matches the shape of the chair, that's the best thing to do. If all I want is just to run into the chair, I can just add a simple collider. So I can select the main node, I can hit the plus button and add a static body. So a static body is what I need if I want to run into something. Let me move this over a little bit. So then the static body needs a collision shape. So I'll hit the plus button again and add a collision shape. And then I can just choose something that matches a chair, like a box shape. And then I can just roughly match the shape to the model. So for a simple collision where I just want to run into the chair and I don't really care if it's super accurate or not, this is going to be perfectly fine. It's just a little box collision. It doesn't actually match the mesh, but I will now run into the chair. Or maybe I won't. Maybe I need to set the collision. Yes, I need to set the collision layers. So I need to set this to platforms. Okay. Yeah, so now you can see I bump into the chair. And this chair is too small to sit in anyway, but if I wanted the collision of the object to be a little bit more similar to the actual mesh, another thing that I could do is, let's delete this for a second. I can add a collision to the mesh just like I did with some of my primitive shapes by going to the mesh menu up in the toolbar. So if I go to the mesh menu and I create a collision shape, I can create a static body child, try mesh, and create. And it's gonna take the geometry of the chair and turn that into a collider. So this is a very specific, highly detailed collider. I have to remember to put the right collision layer. And now we run into the chair. So again, this doesn't really make a big difference. It's a little bit more accurate, but for something that I'm just running into, it's not necessary to have that much more detailed of a collider. And it's going to take up more performance, more processing power. So this isn't something you would want to do unless maybe you had a big wheelbarrow and you want to walk down the side of the wheelbarrow, or maybe later we want to walk through our submarine. Then you would want a collider that actually matches the mesh. For the chair, we don't really need the collider to match the mesh that much. Okay, so a couple other options to get different amounts of similarity. So I'm going to delete this one. So another thing that we could do is we could just recreate it with a couple of simple collisions. So I can do the same thing where I add a static body, and I can actually add multiple collision shapes to my static body. So if I want a little bit closer to the real chair, I can add 2 collision shapes. And then I can use one. They shouldn't be parented to each other. They just both want to be in the static body. And so I can use one for sort of the bottom of the chair. And normally I want the collision shape to be pretty similar to what we see visually with the mesh, but sometimes you might want to make it a little bit smaller so you overlap with the mesh a little bit. It depends on what you're going for. You definitely don't want to make it too big because then you'll run into the thing before you're actually overlapping with it visually. So my first collision shape is the body of the chair. My second collision shape is going to be the top of the chair. And both of these shapes will be part of the same static body. So we can set the collision layer just to the one static body, and that'll work perfectly fine. Okay, so that's close enough. If I set the collision layer correctly, now I'll have the same result. Okay. So that's pretty decent. The last way is kind of the most complex way, but if you have a really complicated model, but you don't want to create a mesh out of its geometry because it's going to hurt the performance, what we can do is we can use Blender to make a simplified version of the mesh and then use that as our mesh static body. This is a little more complicated, but it could be useful, so I'll just go through it real quick. But the method I just showed is probably, most of the time, that's going to be the preferred method. So I want a slightly more complex collision shape, but I don't want it to be as complex as the chair. So I'll go back to my chair model. I'm going to go into wireframe view. So what I would do now is I would take my chair mesh, and then I would make a copy. So I'm going to duplicate the mesh. I can't do it here, so I'll do it in the editor window. So I'll hit Shift D, and then just click so it stays in the same place. And I'm going to rename this collider, or chair collider. And I'll rename this chair mesh. Okay. So then I'll take my chair collider, and I'll do a decimate modifier. So just like we showed before, I'll go over here to the properties window. I'll go to my modifiers. I'll go to generate and decimate. And then I'll start with like 0.5. And let's hide the mesh for a second. And I just want to take this down until it looks basically the same as the chair, but there's a lot less data. Because this is just a collider, we're not going to be able to see it. We're just going to run into it. So I'm moving this ratio down until I have as little faces as I think I can get away with. That's pretty good. And then I'm going to apply this. And so now I have two meshes. The collider mesh, which is what I'm going to use for the collider, and the chair mesh, which is what I'll use for the visual mesh for the chair. So now I'm going to export this. The one tricky part with this is if I make changes to this later, like I scale it, I need to make sure to scale both of them. So let's actually do that. So I'll select both of these guys, and I'll hit S and 2. I'll scale both of them. And then the one tricky part here is that if I hit Control A and apply scale, I'm not sure that it's going to apply to both. So let's choose, okay, it did. So it applied to both of them, so that's good. Okay, so now we can export it. So I'm gonna select both of them, go to File, Export, and do GLB, and oh, it didn't overwrite the previous one because I didn't name it correctly. So let's click on that and export. Let's go back to Godot. Okay, now my chair is bigger. It lost some material because we changed how the mesh works. Okay, so now we have the chair mesh, which is our original chair, which looks good. Let's add our material back on there. And then we have this chair collider, which looks bad, but it's not intended to be used as a visual mesh. It's intended to be used as a collider mesh. So now what I can do is click on the chair collider, go to Mesh, create collision shape, make a static body child. And so now I have this static body that matches my shape, but it's much simpler. So now I don't need the chair collider anymore. I'm going to take this static body and drag it up here to my chair mesh and turn that collider off and turn my chair mesh back on. And now you can see I have a nice collider that matches the chair, but it doesn't have a lot of data, so it's better for performance. This is obviously the most sort of labor-intensive way to do this, but it is going to create a better mesh. And now that my chair is bigger, I might even be able to jump on top of it, although I can't quite. Let's increase my player's jump ability a little bit. So now I can jump on top of the chair. And if it was a little bigger, I could even probably fit under there. Oh, I still can't get up there. I made it too big. Okay, let's give me like easy jump height. Okay, so now I can get on the chair. I can even get on the top of the chair. And so with a more complicated mesh, I can interact with more of the geometry. But by simplifying the original mesh, I save a lot on the performance. Okay, so those are a few different approaches. They get slightly more complex, but all of them are, kind of equally as useful as the others. So I think that's enough. Let's go over, I'll do one with the submarine just to have another example, because it would be fun to be able to jump over here. So let's do the same thing with the submarine, just to kind of repeat the example, but any one of those approaches is perfectly fine. All right, so I'll just do that with the submarine real quick. So I'll go back to Blender. I'm gonna make a new general project. I'm gonna delete everything in the scene, and then I'm gonna import my submarine from my game. Okay, so as we saw before, our submarine has a lot of stuff, including the body mesh. So I'm going to ignore everything except the body mesh, because the body mesh is the main thing that I'll want to interact with. But I want to make a simplified version of this mesh to use as a collider. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn on the wireframe view. I don't need to do that. I'm just doing it to visualize the mesh. I'm going to hit Shift D to duplicate the mesh. And then I'm going to rename this mesh body collider. And then I'm going to hide the body mesh for now. And I'll open up this properties window and go to modifier, go to generate and decimate. And then I'm just going to, I don't want to get too crazy so it doesn't work, but I want to reduce the number of triangles by as much as possible. Okay, so I think that's pretty good. I might be even able to get a little bit lower. Okay, I think that's probably pretty good. I'm gonna leave it there. So I'm gonna apply this. And so now I've got my body collider. I'm gonna bring back all of these guys. And so it's pretty much exactly the same thing, except with that extra mesh for the collider. So then I'm going to export GLTF and go back to my game project and go to models. And this one is a GLTF, so I'm going to replace my submarine. And I got to make sure to put the textures in the right place. Okay, so it's re-importing my submarine. So here's my submarine over here. And it looks a little weird because I have this extra mesh. But we're going to fix that. So I'm going to take the submarine. I'm going to move it down a little bit so I can jump on it. And then I'm going to right-click and go to Editable Children. And I'm going to find the body collider. I'm going to go... I'm running out of this room a little bit, but let's find the body collider. Oh, here's the mesh menu. I'm going to create a collision shape. And then I'm going to put that collision shape in the body mesh. And hide the body collider. And then I'm just going to make sure that I have the right layer on for my collision. And there we go. Now you can see that collider mesh. It's a simplified version of the visual mesh. And so I should be able to jump on the submarine now. I might not be able to actually get up. Let's see if I can jump up here. Oh, there we go. Okay. I guess I missed a part, but you get the basic idea. I don't know why I fell through the bottom. Maybe there's not enough geometry there, but you could also just add extra shapes in there to fill that out. But yeah, that's the basic idea. So again, to make it so that we can run into the models, we need some type of collision shape. If the models are simple, you can just use basic primitives. That's probably the easiest approach. But if you have a complex model like this submarine and you want the collision geometry to match the visual geometry, you may want to use Blender to make that extra collision shape. Okay, I'm going to stop here.